1. I used to live in an apartment complex where you needed a parking permit to park. When I first moved in, there was assigned parking, but that stopped a few months in. Due to a bout of bad luck, I was renting a car. I hadn't grabbed the parking permit for either of the cars that ended up in the shop, so I didn't think to grab that permit. I asked the front office if I needed to get anything for the rental car. I was told that I did not. Around this time, the parking lot was getting resurfaced, so parking enforcement was pretty lax. I'm not sure why exactly, because the resurfacing project reduced the number of available spaces to basically zero, so you think they'd enforce strictly against people who didn't have a permit. I ended up having the rental car for over a month, so it outlasted the resurfacing project by a couple weeks. I didn't have a problem parking the rental until after the resurfacing project was finished. I woke up one morning to find a boot on the rental. There was a card on the window with the number for the towing company who had placed the boot. The fine for removal was $75. I tried calling the number on the card but got a voicemail. This annoyed the hell out of me because they had placed the boot sometime late at night, but weren't available in the morning. I borrowed my wife's car because she didn't need to go to work that day and drove to work. On getting to work, I found that I had a text message from the towing company requesting the make and model of the car. I called back and left another message requesting a callback. They sent me another text message telling me that they only communicate via text message. I hate texting. And because I woke up to find a boot on a rental, I was already in a bad mood. I texted back, admittedly rudely, that I wouldn't text with them because they're a corporation. I had no response after half an hour, so I texted again threatening to contact the Attorney General's office. This got their attention. After another brief back and forth, their supervisor called me. The supervisor explained why the boot was placed, as though that was not obvious to me. I explained the situation to him, and to his credit, he actually listened. I was pretty angry about the inconvenience. My drive to work at the time was about 45 minutes, and then I dumped another half hour into this interaction, but I was still calm. The supervisor offered me what he called a $50 discount, which to him meant I would pay a discounted rate of $50. This term confused me, so I asked for clarification, as a $50 discount meant to me I would have $50 taken off the cost of the removal. Asking for clarification set this guy off, because he felt as though I was arguing with him, and even accused me of twisting his words. This pissed me off far more than it should have, so I told him I wouldn't pay a cent. He told me good luck with that, and to call him when I wanted to pay the fine. I called the apartment management and explained what happened. The manager remembered me coming in and explained that he thought I'd only have the rental for a few days. He was apologetic. Then I told him that I'd been dealing with the towing company for over an hour at that point, and that the towing company had been less than cooperative in getting the boot removed. The manager was unhappy to hear that, and he told me that he'd call me back. 5 minutes later I got a call back, the boot would be removed, and I wouldn't pay anything. I had assumed the company got paid by the apartment, but the manager later told me they didn't pay anything either. 2. I took civil engineering about 12 years ago to a college in Ontario, Canada. I graduated, only about 15 graduated, and got the hell out and never looked back, due to their arrogance and asshole teacher. I had an issue with one professor who just hated me from day one, year one. I don't know what I did, and my 2 friends at college in the same course also didn't know. The professor would talk to both my friends and say hi in the hallway, and literally ignore me at the same time. After the first year, we found it funny because it was so obvious. The best theory we have is that I was drawing a picture and he said it looked like such and such a thing, and I said no, it definitely doesn't. Seriously, that's all we can come up with, and we tried for years to work it out. So anyways, in year 2, the professor started grading me harder than others. My friends and I would do a project, and they'd get a passing mark, and I'd get a fail. It was almost comical, except it was sort of my future life he's messing with, so I took it seriously. Well, after almost 2 years of it, I requested a meeting with the new dean. The new dean was his friend, and the professor took the dean's old job. The dean told me straight up that they wouldn't do anything because they were friends. But I showed them. He failed me by 2% in one vital course, which was needed for future courses in year 3. Because of this, he put me back a year, hoping they'd get me to quit. So I stayed, and did the course again, and also took some courses again I wanted more info in. I realized the professor was just reading his daily lessons from one big binder. It had the day and what to teach, and even jokes and stories to tell. Well, I happened to take excellent notes on a laptop since day 1, year 1 of the course. They weren't as popular back then. We had like 2 in the class, including mine. It had everything. I even mentioned the stories the professor was saying in case they were on an exam. Also his annoying jokes. So, at the end of the year, I gave out all my notes to the years below me. Every test, every exam, every project, every single thing. To every student who wanted it. From then on, everyone in each year had everything the professor was about to say and teach, and just stopped taking notes, which pissed off the professor to no end. His daily plan for the last 15 years was just to write notes on a board as fast as he could, and then erase them, forcing students to miss info or just write by hand as fast as possible, and he'd waste his hour or 2 of class doing that. Now, since everybody had notes of what he was going to write, everybody just watched him, forcing him to actually work. And I was in the classes watching sometimes. It was awesome, and I would sit and smile and he couldn't do anything. I passed each course with such a high percentage he couldn't fail me. On our graduation day, I mentioned to another professor I was going to mention it to the asshole professor what I had done with my notes and how mean he was all these years. Well, guess who couldn't make it to graduation? It was a fun day. I got to tell all the other profs anyways at the party after, and they admitted they knew he didn't like me. That's it. Have a great day. Choose your college and uni carefully. Good luck. 3. Some years back, I worked for a billing company doing an absolute ton of different things. I had a mix of daily tasks which had to be done first, and other tasks with assorted deadlines. Because of this, relatively quickly after I was done with training, I was working overtime constantly. The daily tasks tended to chew up most of the day, and I needed overtime to work on the other tasks. My boss, Chad, fits what he thought of himself, was a big penny pincher though. So after I'd had consistent overtime for a week, I got pulled into the office.
Pat, I see you've been doing a lot of overtime. From now on, I want no more overtime whatsoever.
But Chad, I won't be able to get all of the work done without overtime.
We can't afford to pay overtime right now, so just do your best.
I shrugged and went back to work. Chad had a bad habit of undervaluing the work of others, so I figured his tune would change fairly quickly. A little over 1 week later and I'm back in the office. At the time I had assumed malicious compliance complete, but things got strange.
Pat, I've been told you don't have the coding done for the upcoming project.
Well, you told me no overtime, and my daily tasks take up too much of my work hours. I don't have enough time to do those projects.
Well, you need to get these things done. So work whatever hours you need to, but make sure that at the end of the week you're still only working 40 hours.
After a brief pause of shock, so you want me to work however long I need to and then leave early on Fridays? He's barely paying attention and says,
Yes, just get the work done.
A strange policy, to be sure, but a welcome one. Chad didn't realize the box he had opened. Working overtime Monday to Thursday did allow me to get the other projects on my plate done, but it also meant that every Friday I would leave early. Very early. Some weeks I only worked 1 or 2 hours. This meant that sometimes the daily tasks didn't get done, and had to be lumped into Mondays. It took a few months for Chad to notice.
Pat, I heard you've been leaving early on Fridays. You can't just leave when you want. It makes the other employees jealous, and it's delaying tasks over the weekend. You can't just make your own hours. Who okayed this?
Well, you did, Chad. I'm working the schedule you told me to work. I needed the overtime to get all of my tasks done, and this was your solution.
Well, I don't remember that.
A flush of color indicated he did indeed remember that.
Look, just email me for approval every time you need overtime.
Now at this point I thought the malicious compliance was over, but unknown to me, the saga was continuing without me even intending to. Because I listened to my boss. I emailed every time I needed to work overtime, which was every day, like clockwork. I had an alarm. 1 hour before my shift ended, I would draft a fresh email with the fresh reason for that particular day and send it. I foolishly thought nothing was wrong. Chad approved every time, request fulfilled. But then a month later, back to the office.
Pat, I've decided that I can trust you to handle your own overtime, so you don't need to email me for approval anymore.
Oh, well, thanks, I'll make a note of that. I was later told by the HR staff in charge of the timesheets that Chad only told me that because he was sick of dealing with my emails every day. And that's the tale of how I got to, essentially, set my own schedule. As long as it was over 40 hours a week. I'm very happy to no longer be working for Chad. 4. So, the start of this PettyRevenge happened over a year ago. Just found out about the results last week. I'm a 24-year-old male and I used to work at a non-profit as a warehouse associate for their food distribution program. It was a good job for where I was at and where I was in life, easy work, easy hours, good pay. At the time, I had made friends with my fiancé's friends, Jim, a 25-year-old male, and Bailey, 25-year-old non-binary. We played D&D, hung out most weekends, etc. Jim was, frankly, a really bad employee. When we met, he had gone through multiple jobs in a span of a few months, all of them quitting because of various reasons, bad workplace, toxic coworkers, anxiety issues, etc. I felt for him and stuck my neck out to get a job at the warehouse, and he got it. On top of that, he got kicked out of his dad's place and had to move in with Bailey and their mom because he refused to do any of the chores his dad asked him to. All was going well for a while. He was only working part-time, but he seemed to enjoy the new job, got along with everyone, and we had a good time working together. Even though I am a few years younger than him, I have a lot more work experience than he does, so I was even able to mentor him in good work ethic, how to run the forklift and warehouse equipment, and how to get his job done better and more efficiently. Because of me, him and I were the only competent employees in that warehouse for a few months, as we had 2 other associates that were constantly showing up late, leaving early, on their phones more than working, etc. Those being Mary, a 29-year-old female, and Zeke, a 20-year-old male. Now, my intermediate boss wasn't an issue, we got along fine. But the program director, Bethany, late 40s, was a real gatekeep gaslight girl boss. Plus, she wasn't great at her job. Granted, she could write grants really well and get the money we needed, but she spent it on the absolute dumbest shit. Like $30,000 for a cargo box cooler for outside that wasn't meant to be ran 24/7. Blew up after a year and a half. Tiny electric forklifts that would barely lift 300 pounds, an $80,000 gas engine Ford F-250 with a lift and bull bars to pull a trailer that barely weighed a ton. A 30-foot mobile pantry tiny house and solar panels for it that never got installed, and 2 single-axle box trucks that weren't anywhere near rated to haul what we were loading them with. When I voiced opinion or complaints about our equipment or the work ethic of my coworkers, I was blatantly ignored and told, "You need to learn to work with people with different work ethics than yourself." So at that point, I just stopped saying anything, let her dig her own grave, so to speak. Now, back to Jim and Bailey. As we got closer as friends, so began talks of finding a place we could all move in together. Never made any agreement, never shook hands or confirmed anything. Just talked about it. Then, out of nowhere, my older sister brought up moving in with her 3 hours away to her town, where my fiancé and I could finally get out of our hometown and make better money. She even agreed to pay majority rent, first, last, and any fees till we got on our feet. So of course we agreed and started job searching. I decided to let Jim know while we were at work what was going on, and let him know if they wanted, him and Bailey could take over the lease for our current place. Nothing fancy, a studio basically, but a house on a 1/4 acre 5 minutes from the warehouse. And the rent was about 40% lower than anywhere else in town for the same amount of space. Jim seemed to take it fine, said he would let Bailey know, and that was that. Next thing I know, my fiancée is getting her phone blown up with calls and texts, saying we were fucking them over, and I was a misogynistic asshole for talking to Jim at work instead of talking to both of them at the same time. Also decided to tell my fiancée I was manipulating her into ruining their friendship and moving away. At that point, I decided to end the friendship between myself and them, but told my fiancée she was her own person and could make her own decisions on the matter. She, after a few days of thought and more angry texts attacking me and my fiancé, decided to do the same. I tried to talk to Jim at work about it, but all he told me was he didn't think this was the appropriate place to do so, in a very passive-aggressive manner. So I just dropped the matter entirely and kept doing my job. Fast forward a week or two. Sister informs us she decided to move in with her boyfriend instead. No big deal, life goes on, right? At this point, I'm just continuing to do my job as I always have, minus communicating with Jim, other than when it was necessary, to get the job done. Next thing I know, Zeke is no longer being friendly or communicating with me. Mary is telling everyone and their mother I've been trying to fuck her since I got hired, and I'm getting ridden up by Bethany because Jim filed a complaint about me bullying him in the workplace and got it signed by 2 anonymous co-workers, while the only other employee at the time was extremely friendly with me, and we even still hang out to this day. So, obviously, these signers were Zeke and Mary. I just continued to do my work in silence and started looking for a new job. Here comes the PettyRevenge. I have a background in environmental work, so when I found a job opening at the same at-risk youth high school I got my GED from, teaching kids about the environment while doing environmental work, I jumped on it. As an added bonus, that same school provided funding for the warehouse and even handled some employee contracts. Specifically Jim, Zeke, and Mary's contracts. I spent a few months working my ass off, got a few kids graduated, and got my good graces up with the contract manager for the warehouse. I started expressing small opinions at first, like how some people working at the warehouse didn't show the best work ethic, even though they've been there for 3 years, Mary. How some would show up for work late and hungover, Zeke, and how others took advantage of the workplace and would leave early every day and take boxes of food for themselves, Jim. Then the contract manager started asking me questions, specific ones about certain employees and certain program directors. So I shared them, all of them, every single dirty little secret in that warehouse. This post is already long enough, but trust me, there were enough things to tell her about Zeke, Mary, and Jim, and Bethany to write a fucking novel. She just wrote them down, and I never heard an update. All right with me. I've worked long enough to know shit rolls downhill whether I know about the results or not. Fast forward almost a year later. Contract with the school ends. Decided to move on and try and find a more lucrative job so I can start building a family. Poor decision on my part, but hey, life goes on. Ended up working at a grocery store. Money gets tight, and I talked to my former manager at the warehouse, the one that I was cool with, and he says I can come in and pick up some food. Begrudgingly, I go the next day, doing a walk of shame, not excited to face Zeke, Mary, and Jim again, after all the time passed and the waters finally calm. But when I walk in, it's just the manager. No one else. I get my food and we start catching up. Turns out the shit rolled downhill and turned into a whole shit slide. Bethany got investigated by her boss about spending so hard she resigned. Zeke, Mary, and Jim's contracts never got renewed and they all got fired. The school I worked at cut funding to the warehouse because of finding out about how Bethany was spending it, and the nonprofit restructured the whole thing to run off volunteers. At this point, I'm in my car ending the conversation with my manager. Told my manager I'm sorry and feel guilty for the pressure it's put on his job. He asked why I felt guilty. I just shrugged and said, "Oh, no reason." Smiled at him and drove off with a few boxes of free food and the world's biggest shit-eating grin. As I type this, I'm filling out paperwork for a job that's covering relocation to a new town and is paying $10 more an hour than the school paid me. And before I go, additional information for those wondering. My fiancé and I communicated through the whole process. She had known them for several years before I was introduced to the friend group, so she saw through their BS pretty quickly, and was more upset that their longtime friend would say the things they did. She cut them off a few days after the initial freakout from Bailey, when they didn't stop trash-talking me to her, trying to convince her to leave me, because of how much of a misogynistic asshole I am. Those were their choice of words, not mine. The last contact was my fiancé trying to get the $400 back from them they borrowed from her, at which point they also cut contact. It has been suggested that I had a verbal agreement that I backed out of with my former friends. It was hardly a verbal agreement, though I do see where people might be coming from with that. These were offhand discussions during D&D about the four of us saving up to get a big place so we didn't have to squeeze into my fiancé and I's tiny house for D&D every weekend. These discussions were also fueled by weed and beer. I thought I was taking the adult route and speaking to one of them the very next day in person after we had talked to my sister. And when I talked to Jim, I offered to transfer the lease to him for a house on a quarter acre that would have only ran them $800 in rent. When my fiancé brought that up to Bailey during their freakout, Bailey said our house was shitty and they didn't want to live in it. 5. The background. In August of 2013, I left my job as a dispatcher to pursue a new position as a buyer for a major food packaging company in their production department. Dispatching was second to my job of purchasing, however. The dispatching aspect left me working 10 to 12-hour days and being on call 100% of the time. The new company promised it'd be an easy 40-hour work week, with occasional overtime here and there. Unfortunately for me, I did not get this in writing and took the position as a salaried employee. I tried negotiating a 6-month review, with the potential for a raise, but was declined. Oh well, the hours would be less and I was cutting my commute in half. The first month, everything went well. I worked with some really cool people and was proving I could handle the workload with ease. The turn toward Nopesville. Well, right around the 1-year mark, the woman who did purchasing for their maintenance department put in her 2-week notice. This was no surprise because everybody knew she was going to school to become an RN. What was a surprise is that I was now expected to learn and perform her job as well. I already had a pretty good grasp of the first position, and figured taking on the second position would be a good challenge and further prove myself as a valuable employee, with maybe an extra hour's work per day. I asked again for a review, which they agreed to. Despite this company's massive financial success, they never bothered to upgrade their purchasing system for maintenance purposes. There was no inventory system, nor any way to generate a proper purchase order in the system. So I had to manually type out everything onto an Excel spreadsheet, and then generate a generic purchase order in the system. Then I had to track all purchases on a separate document. It was a very cumbersome system that led to me working 12-hour days again. There was no way to track specific items to any vendor without searching through hundreds of files and purchase orders, and hoping someone wrote a decent description. At this point, I was relying solely on the memory of the mechanics, most of which had only been there for less than 6 months, needing to do constant stock checks and asking the mechanics to teach me about some of the processing equipment, so I could have some idea of what I was buying. I was not always at my desk. Despite having a radio on my side at all times, the plant manager complained that I was never in my office, and I needed to notify him via email or radio every time I walked away with a reason. This included going to the bathroom. This isn't elementary school, and my not being at my desk does not put someone's life at risk. I begrudgingly comply, but this is the first major strike in my mind. The rest I chalked up to a loss due to my incompetence, not getting things in writing. Still, I wanted to turn this around and see if I could make this work. I learned the system we used was actually quite versatile, and with a few hours of initial setup, I could build an inventory for the maintenance side of the system, and generate clear and trackable purchase orders. Since I was salary, I could come in on a weekend and knock it out. Halfway through my proposal to the plant manager, he cut me off and told me he didn't want to do it. I tried to explain how this would help the company monetarily and time-wise, not to mention the sad sack that got the position after me having to deal with the same BS. And he flat out said no. Strike 2. We're now at the end of November and into the early part of December 2014. The company is rebranding their pasta sauce line and introducing some new recipes. I had to source several new ingredients and order huge quantities for their first run, which would begin in January of 2015. It was tough, but I was making progress while also barely keeping my head above water in the maintenance department. Then I'm given the news that the woman in charge of purchasing all packing materials is taking a 2-week vacation for Christmas. My requested time off for my birthday the week before Christmas is being denied because I need to cover her position as well. Why? The purchasing manager has not been trained on how to make a purchase order, so now purchasing anything for the entire plant rested on my shoulders. This is now strike 3, and I began posting my resume and applying for jobs again. I was going to continue working until I found something, anything, else to get me away from this place. By this point, I had already discussed quitting with my girlfriend, and my savings would keep me from putting her in any economic harm for at least 6 months with current spending. When I got to work the day before my birthday, I opened my email to find 16 emails from the overnight crew throwing me under the bus for not ordering a certain part. Before I could get through all of them, the plant manager was in my office explaining that I was underperforming, and this couldn't happen again, at the risk of being fired. I showed him the emails that proved the mechanics lied about when they tried to order the part, me following up with the vendor to get a status, and the fact that the mechanic only gave me half of the information the vendor needed. I again explained my plan that would drastically reduce these issues if I had any sort of way to view past purchases, and I would have known exactly what was needed. His response was, "Just deal with it or leave." Strike 4, numbnuts. The malicious compliance. I neatly stacked everything I was working on depending on their status, forwarded a few emails to back up my site to my personal email, and sent an email to the purchasing manager, plant manager, HR, and production manager explaining that I was leaving the company effective immediately and where everything was that I was working on. I included my address to send my final 2 checks to. It was always wrong on my paychecks, which I had several emails asking them to correct, but they handed them out on payday, so it wasn't a huge issue. I collected my things and walked out the door, past all of their offices, which were all empty. Had they been there, I would have stopped to explain. The revenge. A few days later, in what was the normal payday, I received my typical automatic deposit. It was only from the last full period I worked, which did not include a few days I worked into the next period or my accrued vacation time. I had also not received the check stub, which arrived nearly a week later with the incorrect address. It was delivered to the address on the envelope and then finally made its way to me after being returned to the mail carrier. Before I sent another email asking them to correct the address, I decided to look up state laws on payment upon termination of employment. Oh, was it an eye-opener? In my state, if someone quits, they must receive all owed payment within 72 hours. For every day late after that, they are to pay the person as if they were still employed. If they pay on day 4, they are to add 1 additional day's pay. Also, any previous agreement of automatic deposit is voided upon the termination of employment, unless there is a written agreement at that time. There was also a list of state fines associated with each infraction. I composed my email to HR and explained the laws they were violating, as well as requested they update my address. And if they would mail me my final check within 2 days, I would not pursue any legal action. I hoped they would reply with reason. This would all be settled by the middle of next week, which was December 31st, and also 2 days before the scheduled pay. Their response the next day stated that I would receive my automatic deposit on Friday, since I had agreed to that upon my initial employment, and also stated in the employee handbook, which I should refer to. Now you fucked up. It is never a good idea to mess with a guy used to working with contracts and now, thanks to you, has nothing but free time. This time I replied with direct links to the state's website and the laws they were violating, and stating how simple this would be in court. Ignorance of the law is never an excuse, but I found these laws referenced in the employee handbook, proving they had knowledge, had been made aware of it by me, and still actively went against it. All I wanted was what I was due and not asking for anything extra. There was no response until the next day, the deadline I gave them, when FedEx knocked at my door with an envelope containing my check stub. Not an active check. My account had no deposits until that Friday when the normal payday was scheduled. At this point, I am actually impressed with their carelessness and oversight and messing with someone who literally has all day to himself. Now it's time to make a real request for everything I can legally ask for. The email again explained all of the laws they have violated, and requested the full amount due. I even calculated the amount they owed me for the late payment, 16 days minus the 72 hours rounded down to the nearest $5, because I am a generous person. I had kept every email professional because I know that if this does go to court, I cannot look like a complete ass. I already had walking out on a job going against me. Again, hoping they'd side with reason, I detailed how much extra can be awarded to me, up to 3 times the late payment amount, plus a total of the state fines. Their reply this time was simply, no. The court documents were downloaded and filled out the following Monday, but I was going to give them one last chance. Another email, again detailing the laws and the corresponding sections of their employee handbook, citing these laws, and how ignorance of the law is no defense. But explicit knowledge and failure to follow them would not be in their favor. To add a little additional spice, I copied the CEO on this email. I concluded the email requesting resolution by the end of the week, or court documents would be filed. An hour later, I received a response from HR that their lawyer would contact me by the end of the week. By that Friday, I had a check for the late payment, plus a second check for double the amount if I agreed not to take them to court, which I did agree to. Back to what I alluded to in the beginning, since this was now reported income for the 2015 year, I would need a W-2 form from the company in order to file my taxes. On the day I received those checks, I set a reminder to pursue whatever course I could if they failed to do so. My dreams were dashed when my girlfriend sent me a picture of the envelope when it arrived. I even made sure to verify every cent just in case. In the end, I am happy it didn't resort to that. I now have a great job and career path, and I do not want to waste any more time on an old employer. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Revenge is Ice Cream, episode 293, and thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Before you go, please do poke the like button, and if you'd like to get the videos a little bit early, you can support me through Patreon, which is linked in the description. And you'll also find a link to the Hellfreezer merchandise store on Teespring. And let me see, I think there's also a Discord link in there. And if you'd like to support the channel on a more one-off basis, you can make donations during streams or videos just like this one. And while you don't have to do this, I do appreciate it. And it helps pay the bills around here, which lets me do this for as long as I can. Okay, let's see. I have a... No, that's the next video. Okay. I thought I had a birthday shout-out, but no, that's for the next Revenge video, which goes up on Monday. Alright, so no other business today, so let's move right along to Hellfreezer's question of the day. And today's question is... a bit of a nerdy question today, actually. Who is your Superman? There have been so many over the years, going from the likes of Bud Collyer, who did the voice in the old 40s Superman cartoons, Kirk Allen, and I'm leaving out a few. I mean, I think... Ray Middleton. I think he technically might have been the first in the New York World's Fair. Don't quote me on that, because I'm really not doing any research. I'm just sort of glancing at Wikipedia, trying to refresh my memory on some of the names. But mine, a lot of you are going to say Christopher Reeve, and that's fair. I see why. But he wasn't really the one that clicked with me the most. I don't dislike him, but it was based on an older version of Superman. It was sort of outdated when the movie came out. That version of Superman wasn't really around anymore. So I think for me, for a while, back in the 90s, it was actually Dean Cain, who I do not like as a person, but Dean Cain, he was my Superman. He did a good job, I think, for a while. But thankfully, over the years, he's become supplanted by 2 actors. Brandon Routh, although not as he appeared in Superman Returns, because I did not enjoy that movie. But years later, he got a chance to play the role again on it was called The Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was an adaptation of the comic book storyline. I know I'm getting very nerdy here. And he played the part again and did such a good job. But also Tyler Hoechlin on the Superman and Lois TV show. I think, for the moment, for me, he sets the standard as Superman. But who's yours? Or maybe you just don't care, and that's fair enough. There may be a Batman-related question coming in the next video. The next Revenge video. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.